Al segundo día del 12º Congreso Latinoamericano de Lectura y Escritura, estoy seguro que nuestra presentadora Nancy Keranen de por sí llegó un poco nerviosa, y con todos los cambios, ajustes, acomodamientos electrónicos y conexiones, seguramente ya se le bajó la mierda. Esperamos que esté muy tranquila, porque ustedes van a disfrutar mucho esta presentación que Nancy Keranen, profesora de la Facultad de Lenguas de la UAP, ha preparado con el título siguiente: apropiándose de un discurso ajeno, como una carta del siglo XVII al rey Felipe III de España puede ayudarnos a entender, puede ayudarnos a los profesores, ayudar a los estudiantes a aprender aprender el inglés como segunda lengua en escritura académica. Estoy seguro que van a disfrutar mucho de esta muy interesante ponencia y una persona que tiene una gran experiencia y un pensamiento muy original en materia de investigación sobre la escritura académica, sobre la escritura profesional, sobre la supervisión de tesis, el desarrollo de procesos de investigadores. Todo su trabajo, el trabajo de Nancy Keranen, está enmarcado en las teorías de la psicología social, de la teoría social y cognitiva y de las teorías críticas. Nancy tiene su doctorado de la Universidad de Lancaster, en el Reino Unido. Es actualmente profesora asociada de la Facultad de Lenguas, como les dije, de la UAP. Es investigadora del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, y es una persona que está aportando cosas muy interesantes sobre la escritura en una segunda lengua. Le damos la palabra a Nancy, pero antes les quiero decir que, porque se ha cortado un poquito la sesión de hoy, teníamos 1 hora y media, ahora tenemos 1 hora 10 minutos. La presentación de Nancy durará unos 45-50 minutos. Habrá traducción simultánea, ella presentará en inglés, habrá interpretación simultánea. Al término de la presentación de Nancy, abriremos un espacio para preguntas, respuestas y comentarios. Muy bien, Nancy, tienes la palabra. Gracias.
Okay. First of all, I just want to thank the Congreso, the conference, I forgot the word in English, for inviting me to present here. It's, of course, an amazing place to be and very intimidating. But it's an incredible honor for me to be here, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation. So we'll start with a few stories. Once upon a time, there was a young lady named Eva in a kingdom of knowledge where wisdom was the ultimate goal for their inhabitants. The natives of this place spoke Spanish, yet English became a powerful language because of the influence of the Western kingdom. So the royal families, government, and science people had to learn it and use it for sharing crucial information. Once upon a time, there was a teacher who taught in bilingual elementary school and loved teaching English to children more than anything else. One day, the school's principal came to his classroom and told the happy teacher to become the English coordinator. Are the translations working okay? Is anyone using the simultaneous translation? ¿Está bien esta? Sí, funciona. Okay. Once upon a time, there was an innocent student who had to start writing the first 2 chapters of her thesis in the research seminar 1 to start working on her thesis, which was a requirement to fulfill in order to obtain her degree in Master of Arts in Teaching. She felt very worried. Once upon a time, a teacher called Anita, who needed to write an important paper because she was also a student. She was really worried because she didn't know what to do, and the time passed by. Once upon a time, there was a little tiny girl named Esperanza. She was a newcomer at Mines Ensuring Intelligence. This is the MEI, this is our master's program, community. Popular but unfamiliar town close to the Level Village. Once upon a time, in a far, far kingdom named BUAP, a sad queen lived surrounded by her beloved subjects. They wanted to learn the language spoken in a very powerful nearby kingdom, but it was very difficult for them. And once upon a time, In a very far land called Emion, there was a girl called Rose who used to fall asleep at school. Teachers felt so bad because they thought that their classes were not interesting or attractive at all for this girl. What they did not know is that while Rose was sleeping, she would have fascinating dreams about unplanned or never thought events. Okay. Now, once upon a time, there was a noble prince who lived in a faraway country. As was the custom in these days, his country was invaded by a powerful group. He accepted many of the practices of the group because he saw benefits for himself and his people. However, one day he began to see many problems, so he decided to write a very long letter to a king. And that's what this story is about. It's about writing. Writing is a difficult and complicated task. The complexity increases when writing is done in a language that's not the mother tongue. Add to that discourse conventions and management of text types and rhetorical styles, writing purposes, discipline learning, and writing as a rite of passage into the profession, and the whole process can become overwhelming. This is the situation many students in higher education preparing for entry into the profession find themselves in. Many may feel the loss of control and of their personal identities as they are asked to express themselves with ideas that come from their discipline and in ways that are not familiar and may make them feel like outsiders trying to get inside. And despite the discomfort and occasional agony these experiences can provoke, students in these types of situations eagerly seek entry and wish to be able to manage the discourse in ways that give them access so they can participate, have a voice in their chosen field. As higher education teachers working with graduate thesis students, we have been looking at professional processes as a means for understanding and ultimately helping our students make the transition from student to professional via the thesis project. We work with Spanish-speaking Mexican in-service language teachers who must carry out a final thesis project as part of their graduate program in English language teaching. Issues associated with writing of this nature related to emotion, identity and voice, threshold concepts and transition, and processes of professional enculturation have become central theoretical perspectives in our quest to help our students. Many of these processes come together in Mary Louise Pratt's Art of the Contact Zone article discussed further on. Her article led us to the story of Guam, which we write about here, we'll speak about here, and in which we see a useful theoretical base for helping our thesis students. Our purpose in this paper is to provide a perspective of Guam work as it relates to our students' thesis writing process, particularly in the initial stages of contact with this often mysterious and daunting task. Guam work has been investigated thoroughly since its rediscovery in 1908. Much of the research on the text is theoretically situated in post-colonial literature. Tying Guam text to our work also intersects post-colonial theory with the theoretical frameworks presented in the previous section, the previous slide. However, our aim with this paper is to illustrate on a conceptual level how what he did can be used to inform our work with our students, who are in a somewhat analogous situation. I'm not sure, can you see that okay? Just my little thing. On this side, we have Guam and Boma, and these are similarities, and these are our thesis students. So in terms of similarities, they're both members of a subordinate group. They are voluntarily seeking entry into a dominant group in this process of enculturation. And entry into the group is seen as life improving, having to function in a second or additional language, which is appropriation. And they both need to conform to certain discourse conventions, and they need to engage in careful editing and revision of documents to ensure audience understanding, which we'll see further on. Of course, there's differences, transitioning from one culture to another while maintaining identity and voice. And this is a process of transculturation, which we'll discuss further on. And of course, there's differences because for Guam, writing in the 17th century, he was his writing was motivated by the desire for social change and working primarily alone. And while our thesis students over here, their thesis writing is motivated by professional demands and desires, and working in a group of peers and with the assistance of a teacher, and of course they're in the 21st century. So to accomplish the aims of our paper, to accomplish our aims, the paper is laid out as follows. So first we're going to discuss Guaman-Poma and his letter, and then we try to select elements of the letter that help illustrate the main focus of our paper, and which are those issues of abrogation, appropriation, transculturation, and enculturation. Then we provide a brief discussion of Pratt's context and use Guaman-Poma's letter to illustrate that theory. And then finally, we bring in our students and how we manage their thesis writing from the perspectives presented. So going on with Guaman-Poma, he was an indigenous Andean who lived in Peru during the time of the Spanish conquest. He is thought to have been born around 1535 and lived until after 1616. He claims, and this has been supported by other contemporary documents, that he was from the Mixmacuna royalty. This ethnic group was allowed by the Inca power to settle in newly conquered land, displacing the previous group. And this situation was later to play a significant role in his motivation to write the letter. He was a converted and devout Christian, and there seems to be good evidence that he may have worked in the Spanish administration and certainly worked as a translator for a number of religious leaders. Guaman-Poma supposedly learned to read and write from his half-brother, whose Spanish father permitted him to be educated and who passed that learning on to Guaman-Poma. Poma took advantage of his literacy skills in Spanish and his knowledge of his first language to work as an intermediary between the two cultures. These pictures that you're looking at are actually his line drawings from the manuscript. And the reason they look a little messy is that he wrote on both sides of the parchment, and the ink has come through slightly. So on all of the pictures, you can see the reverse page almost. Okay. So he used his knowledge of his first language to work as an intermediary between the two cultures. It's clear that he saw a place for himself in the world created by the Spanish invasion. Many indigenous people from royal classes actively sought entry into the colonizers' world. Much of the papers and the research on Guaman-Poma has been carried out by this researcher, Rolina Adorno, and talking about how the indigenous people from the upper classes sought entry into the dominant culture. This is a quotation from her, and it says, on the whole, these individuals, the Andean elite, responded eagerly to the chance to seek offices and privileges in the colonial system. Starting in the 1550s, native lords served as subordinates to Spanish colonial administrators, and they continued to compete for positions in the Spanish colonial bureaucracy after the reorganization of native society under the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo. Guaman-Poma's documented experience offers a vivid example of this tendency, and he served in many of the intermediary roles played by Andeans who learned Spanish. Through his various types of work in the colonial government and in a number of positions with the religious power that came with the colonizing group, he became familiar with contemporary European customs, legal and religious systems, and literary genres. The turning point in his life and the resulting manuscript came as the result of a decades-long legal land dispute with another indigenous group, the Chachapoyas. As briefly mentioned above, Guaman-Poma's family was part of a tribal group allowed to colonize a land area as reward for their collaboration with the Incas, the larger power group. The dispute began when a Spanish official allegedly granted the same lands to the Chachapoyas as reward for their service to the Spanish crown. After years of litigation and conflict, Guaman-Poma eventually lost the case and was convicted of being a common Indian who, through deceit and trickery, called himself a cacique and was neither a cacique cacique nor a principal, yet he subordinated Indians so that they respected him as such. He always behaved and sought offices with malicious intentions and deceits, and was an Indian of evil inclinations, and all the rest as should be evident. So this was his sort of denunciation. So he went from being an elite person with a lot of power to lower than the lowest. His punishment was 20 lashes, which is quite severe, and banishment from his ancestral city for 4 years. His status as royalty, Spanish collaborator, and religious functionary dissolved. As a result of this experience, he spent the next 10 years of his life as a social activist and produced his outstanding text intended for the King of Spain. Two purposes of the text were to give the king an account of ancient Andean history from the beginning of time to the reign of the Incas, and to inform the monarch about the deepening crisis in Andean society that was the result of Spanish colonization. This is the front page of the document. Juan Poma sent the letter to Spain from Lima in 1615. Less than 50 years later, it was in the collection of the Royal Copenhagen Library. Whether the King of Spain ever saw it is unknown. It's also not clear how it ended up in Copenhagen, but certain evidence indicates it was acquired and donated to the library by a Danish diplomat serving in Spain at the time. The manuscript was seemingly forgotten for several hundred years and was discovered in 1908 by the German anthropologist Richard Fleischmann. The letter is, no, I know you can't see that, but that's the outline of the letter. The letter is 1,189 pages long. It contains 791 pages of written text and 398 pages of catch and line drawing. So even to call it a letter is a bit misleading. It's laid out in 26 quires. A quire is one of these things here, and a quire contains several chapters. It's comprised of, so there's two principal sections. This is called the New Chronicle, and this is where he talks about the history of his people. This is the front page of it. And the second section is called Good Government and Justice, and this is where he describes his viewpoints on how the government should be run in his country. Based on the construction and the evidence detailed revisions to the second section, to this one, it seems clear that this was the principal focus of the text, advising the King of Spain on how things should be managed in the Peruvian colony. Nevertheless, the second section would not have the same impact without the detailed Andean history of the first half, which not only gives an Andean worldview and history of the tribal peoples, but also situates that in the European and Christian histories available at the time. The history of both cultures are set out in 5 ages framework. The ages of the world beginning with Adam and Eve, as you see on the left side, and ending with the birth of Christ, and in a parallel construction, the ages of the Indians beginning with the first man and woman, as you see on the right side, and ending with the age of the Incas. Juan Poma chooses to write in the language of the colonizer because the message is for them, specifically for the King of Spain, Philip III. In post-colonial literature, the term abrogation is frequently used alongside appropriation when referring to the choice by the colonized to use the colonist's language. The term abrogation challenges the notion that the colonized is somehow expressing the totality of the subjugation by choosing to express him or herself in the colonizing language. The concept widens the choice of language as an additional tool available to the writer, and then leads the conceptual way to language appropriation, exemplified by Poma's use of Spanish to accomplish its rhetorical aims. In the letter, the writing concept and system is European. The Incan Empire did not have a written language, and it's believed to be one of the world's largest bureaucracies, successfully sustained through generations without any form of writing. Juan Poma appropriates the writing system and the language of the Spaniards, but he does this bilingually, using the letter sound system of Spanish to write his Quechua language. His use of Spanish has been the object of much research. Earlier studies in the 1940s and 50s tended to focus on linguistic features from mainly a deficit perspective, as in errors in grammar and spelling. More recent studies in the later 20th century and 21st century, on the contrary, have recognized the control of expression and rhetorical effectiveness. The Spanish is now known to be closely associated with the oral forms of the language that in 17th century time, in that time frame. A researcher, Uriasti, provides a comparison of a paraphrase of Quechua excerpts, which is the first one, then in standard Spanish here, and then this is Guamantloma's translation of the Quechua. So if you look at this one, you can see, if you're looking at it from a deficit perspective, you can see grammatical, lexical, and spelling errors. However, considered from the evidence of later research, which took into account the rhetorical expression and the connection of the prose with spoken 17th century Castellan, then Guamantloma's prose can be seen as remarkable in its mastery and manipulation of the resources of written language. Besides writing in Spanish, Ploma also used a number of Quechua dialects. He used at least 3 varieties depending on the context, one for the Inca, one to present the Spaniards' use of Quechua, and one using Quechua grammatical conventions with Spanish morphemes. These different forms allowed him a range of nuanced expression, which supports the research indicating Ploma's linguistic skills. His use of Quechua serves several rhetorical purposes. He uses it when explaining Andean cultural elements. Lists of Quechua words with Spanish translations are found throughout the document. Uriasti identifies the list as ethno-categories of the Andean world. Guamantploma provides lists of objects, plants, institutions, social positions, occupations, all shedding light on the conceptions of the Andeans and their world. Zaminsky, another researcher, studied the use of Quechua in the manuscript in the expression of prayers and religious petitions to their gods and the god of Spanish colonizers. This work gives us a window into the beliefs of God and creation of the Andean people, and how at least Guamantploma created a synthesis of Andean gods and the Christian God. Close exegesis of the study is beyond the scope of the paper, but as an example, Zaminsky identifies 5 different names for what appear to be the equivalent of the Christian God. Biblical references in the prayers recorded in Quechua with the 5 names indicates that Ploma is regarding a supernatural being as an amalgam of Inca and pre-Incan gods, a strategy not unheard of in the Church's colonization of pre-Christian cultures. Guamantploma also uses a number of literary devices in the text. Uriasti identifies these as ethnographic projections in which irony, satire, speeches, and sermons reflect the various types of discourse in use at the time. He cites numerous occurrences of these types of discourses throughout and selects several that exemplify the types. One dialogue provides a view of the relationship between an Andean and a priest. The dialogue, this is a picture of the priest which he drew, and the priest is wearing the most elaborate garments that he could possibly find. And so he's almost making a sort of satire of these priests who are supposed to be, sort of workers of the people. And the dialogue is in Quechua and Spanish translations. The Andean asks permission to return to his fields so he can tend to his crops and animals, and then provide his tribute to the church. In reply, the priest goes through a long list of items he is expecting as a form of tribute. He admonishes that the farmer must sow the seeds for him. The girls need to take care of his goats, sheep, llamas, and chickens. They also need to spin and weave for him. Then they must send 100 partridges, eggs, chickens, a measure of potatoes, and corn. He ends by telling the farmer not to fail him or he will be punished. He is the priest and the owner, and the farmer should serve him well. This and the many other discourses provide a wealth of views from the Andean perspective into the colonial world and the objects, attitudes, and relationships which occurred there. As discussed further on, Guamantploma's letter exemplifies writing in the contact zone, communication that takes place in transitional settings. His writing reflects his perceptions and is skillfully crafted to express these to people who occupy a different world, a world that he sees himself as part of. As evident in the written text, examples briefly mentioned above, he appropriates portions of that world and combines those with his own discourses to express his ideas to achieve his rhetorical goals. What makes the text even more outstanding are the illustrations, which graphically achieve what he has done with the written text. Together they've been regarded as an artistic work necessary for fully understanding his rhetorical aims. The illustrations comprise almost half the document. They were all drawn by IMAC-Puebla. They are usually presented first and then followed by text associated with the illustration. Fraser observes that although the document is ostensibly a letter to the king, it's more like an illustrated manuscript. The intention of the illustrations was to make the document as attractive as possible to the king. This is a translation into English of IMAC-Puebla's explanation why he used the illustrations. He says, "I have worked to achieve my desire of presenting to your majesty this present book, titled First New Chronicle of the Indies of Peru, written and drawn by my hand skill, so that the variety of them, and the paintings, and the invention and design to which your majesty is inclined, will make easy the weight and trouble of reading a work lacking in invention and in elegance and clarity of style, which one finds in the great masters." Fraser sees the illustrations as a strategy to compensate for any linguistic failings or for the lack of elegance in prose that the king would have been accustomed to. Puebla also provided the illustrations because he believed the king was interested in art and thus they would appeal to him as a perspective, so showing the interest in the audience. These illustrations include a number of strategies to entertain, hold the attention, and to move the reader along through the text. He uses different letter sizes and styles as headers and titles to accomplish some of these aims. And here you can see him varying the size of the sections and using different types of fonts to move his message along. The strategies were also used in other manuscripts and books of the time. Going beyond what was common, he also uses calligraphic strategies to amplify the meaning of a particular word. For example, in this illustration, he's talking about the conversion to Christianity, and he uses a biblical imagery of the sea being sown to represent conversion to Christianity. The text is written in the form of something that looks somewhat like a plant. And then this illustration shows the first three letters of the word conquista. You see the rest of the word conquista there, and of course with his spelling. But here it's quite difficult to see, but he's using mythological animals here to spell the first part of the word. And these have been described as devilish and grotesque animals. And so spelling out the words using these types of figures was found throughout a number of media in the time. But he uses it as a device to signal a pivotal point in the structure of his narrative. So he's showing that now I'm going to start talking about the conquista. Now, Puebla's illustrations follow European conventions again and use European subject matter, but his worldview expressed in his pictures is Andean. As in the text portion, he appropriates the colonizer's discourse to put forward his perspective. This is most evident in his parallel constructions of the age of the world. So this illustration shows the deliberate relationship between Adam and Eve and the first Indians. They look very similar. Many of the illustrations in the 5 ages seek to establish the Indians as worshippers of the Christian God even before the conquista. And this is his illustration showing the San Bartolome, who is a saint who it was claimed came to the New World just after the death of Christ, so way before the Spaniards came. So he said, well, we were already Christians. While he creates a space for the Andean and the Spanish world, he also uses his illustrations and text to denounce what he sees as extreme abuses of power. The following few illustrations show how he constructs his text using Andean semiotic strategies to show the Spanish abuse. So looking again at this illustration, on the left part, he's retelling the history of the world in 5 ages, so beginning with Adam and Eve. On the right is the parallel story of the history of the Indians in 5 ages. Looking at the pictures of Adam and Eve, Adam is on the left and Eve is on the right in a subordinate position. The stick Adam holds forms a diagonal left to right line. So, yeah, okay. It forms this left to right line, and so does this. Okay. The stick Adam holds. Okay. This pattern is repeated in the drawing of the first Indians, and in the drawing of this is he makes a whole history of the various ages of the Indians, and this is the third Inca, and you can see the same diagonal line there in this tool that he's holding here. Okay. In this illustration, he offers a criticism and a denunciation of Spanish abuses of power. The Spaniard is on the right and higher than the Andean on the left. It is difficult. There's the Spaniard, and here's this guy on the left. And then they're down here being punished. So the whole thing is reversed. Instead of the power being on this side, it's on this side, and the subordinates are on the opposite side. The diagonals held by the Punisher and the Spanish indicate power, so these things again are the semiotic tools to indicate power. However, the diagonal is reversed from top right to bottom left. Guaman is using this semiotic text to expose and denounce the systemic abuse of power. So he basically says that everything is turned upside down. In fact, he uses the phrase, he says, mundo al revés. While the script is appropriated from the dominant culture, the semiotic expressions, in many cases evidenced in the line drawings, are clearly an Andean voice, which uses a form of representation that is associated with their specific way of representing the world. These illustrations show examples of language abrogation and appropriation. Mary-Louise Pratt uses Guaman to illustrate what she calls the arts of the contact zone. She defines the contact zone as social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power. Some of the arts of the contact zone are collaboration, bilingualism, vernacular expression, parody, critique, and denunciation, imaginary dialogue, autoethnography, and transculturation. Guaman engaged in all of these arts. He collaborates with the power culture through his work with the Spanish government and vast knowledge of it, and his work with the religious power as a translator and co-author and illustrator of text. In his letter, and as we can assume in other texts he produced as a translator, employed by the Spanish-speaking church, he uses both Quechua and Spanish, in other words, bilingualism. In addition to the vernacular expression he uses to construct the basic format of the letter. He also uses parody, critique, and denunciation. And finally, his letter is an example of transculturation. The asymmetrical power structures of education and knowledge construction have been a focus of research for a long time. In higher education, many students as subordinates seek entry into the dominant sphere of higher education by learning and eventually conforming to discourse controlled by those in power. Similar to the elite Andeans, students willingly enter their professions as they construct their life trajectories. However, barriers of power still exist. This is especially clear in instances where the student is required to function in a language other than their mother tongue in order to survive in their chosen professions. Nevertheless, it's clear why this is necessary. It's not always merely the negative business of moving into or belonging to a profession. It is a shared method of communication. It provides a common ground for all participants that creates solidarity and understanding. A number of terms have been applied to this process of moving from one culture to another. Assimilation seems to be the most pejorative in its implication that someone fully abandons or is forced to abandon their culture and take up a target culture. Acculturation describes the complex process of moving from one culture to another, most commonly referring to cultures with different native languages. Enculturation is often associated with professional socialization theories, which attempt to describe and understand the processes individuals move through as they become members of their chosen professional cultures. None of these processes are without their benefits and their evils. However, how and why a person comes in contact with different cultures will determine the value of the outcome. Transculturation, a term coined by Fernando Ortiz, a Cuban anthropologist, to fill the theoretical gaps or descriptive inadequacies of the other terms, refers to the processes taken up by subordinate groups, usually involving elements from the dominant group, as exemplified by Guam-Puebla's letter, as they negotiate their positions in the new culture, regardless of whether the contact by the dominant culture is by force, for example, Spanish conquest, or by choice, a student entering profession, or a combination of both, in the case of Guam-Puebla. What seems clear is that change, even in its most benign and desired form, can be difficult and complicated. In the remainder of the paper, then, we discuss our method of helping non-native English-speaking thesis students based on Pratt's context zone and the theories of transculturation and enculturation move through the initial stages of professional socialization, a small step which we have used over a number of years and have come to see as an essential transcultural bridge into the world of higher education research, particularly associated with the production of the thesis project. Many students in higher education are in a process of transitioning from a home cultural setting into their professional cultural settings as they move through the processes of professional enculturation. The students in the research context, which I'll describe further on, are moving into an academic and professional world where the dominant language is English, which is other than their own Spanish. In the end, they seek entry into their chosen profession, but there is a gap from where they are and their established identities and where they seek to move to. Something needs to be constructed to bridge that gap. So we use Guam-Puebla's story and the concept of the contact zone to make that sort of tiny bridge as the first step in the process of what we hope will be a process of transculturation, which will ease them into enculturation. The students we work with are Mexican Spanish-speaking in-service English language teachers. The teachers are in a graduate program in a large public Mexican research university in the Faculty of Modern Languages. They need to write a thesis in English to complete the program, and to help them accomplish this significant event, they have a thesis seminar in the fall and spring terms. In the fall term, they select a topic, design a project, and write chapters 1 and 2 of their thesis. To ease them into this process, we take them through 3 steps. In a way similar to Guam-Puebla, these students are seeking entry into a group that uses a range of group-specific discourses. Guam-Puebla first had to learn the colonizer's discourse customs so he could participate and have a voice in that group. The students are moving into the discourse community of research in language learning and applied linguistics. To do that, they need to learn the methods and discourse conventions. This is why we first begin with this model, generally referred to as IMRAD, the IMRD, which stands for Introduction, Method, Research, and Discussion Model, which is found everywhere. It's a common model of research, the basic model we use in the thesis. This gives them the vital discipline knowledge that allows them to begin learning the discourse. When they work through this model, they see that research design and planning is not a left-to-right sequential activity. So in other words, designing research doesn't start here and end here. When they have a problem or a question, they have to know the background before they can even have a question. They need to know what exists already. In other words, what's already known about this particular topic. So for example, if they want to investigate something about classroom interaction, they have to know that classroom interaction as an entity exists, right? Before they can even ask the question. So they've got to know what is out there in the world before they can ask their questions. And then when they formulate a question here, they've also got to know at the same time the significance of the question. Is the question worth asking? And then also they have to know how they're going to answer it and what sort of potential answers they could find with this question. So it is kind of a whole system that goes around and around, and it neatly fits with the chapters of their thesis. So like Guam-Puebla knew a wide spectrum of discourse conventions, European and Andean, and he used that to craft his letter. He skillfully put them together to achieve his rhetorical aims. Likewise, the students need to be familiar with the specific genre used in thesis writing so they can use it to achieve their rhetorical aims, successfully writing a thesis and defending it. So as part of this second step. We have the previous thesis from previous years are archived in the Language Department Library. So in order for them to practice using the basic research model, the IMRAD model, we asked them to think of questions that they could answer by using the previous thesis as their data sources. So in other words, we asked them to engage in a little mini research project so that they can practice using the basic research model. And at the same time, they can answer their questions they have about this document, the genre that they need to write in. So that we tell them that we say their questions should be aimed to gather information from those theses, which can be useful for them when they start to plan their research projects. So their questions seem to be very practical and quantifiable. For example, how many and how long are the various chapters? How many references are there? How many research questions are there? What's the structure of the various chapters, and so on. These questions are then turned into research questions after an appropriate lesson on their characteristics, functions, and purposes. The students then work on their own or in groups to answer their questions. Through this activity, they are familiarizing themselves with the basic research model and with the thesis document they're going to have to produce. So they're doing two things at once here. After the mini research project, they're ready to start thinking about their own thesis projects. Part of the process is going through a developmental route using the IMRAD model. This involves drafts of the models and feedback, making sure all the parts of the model are consistent and actually reflect the kind of project the student has in mind. These are some of their reactions, and I'm sure that this is quite impossible to see. How is it working? No. Oh dear. I was going to zoom in a little bit, but here it goes. These work. So some of the comments, this activity helped me organize my thinking and to see so far what the general structure was going to be. Furthermore, I could realize that everything in my project has to be connected. Even though I already had a thesis topic, it certainly helped me organize my ideas, follow the thesis structure. Well, in my case, this was a good idea too. I organized my ideas, I set up a possible plan for my research, which gave me insights for it, and I could see whether I was planning, what I was planning or not had significance on the field. The IMRAD model was the first step. The example we did in the thesis helped me clarify the type of information I had to write in this model. To present the model in class was a good idea because I could see my partner's model. It was interesting to see most of us focus our attention on different topics. When we wrote the IMRAD model to determine my topic, I was confused because I had a lot of ideas in my mind, and I was worried because the first model I did was not clear, I suppose, but once I read about the topics, I had a better idea. Okay, so generally, very positive reactions to it in terms of helping them sort of organize information. And once they do that, really, with their research topic, they can see their project from the very beginning all the way to the end. However, not only do they need to know the discourse conventions in their chosen field, they need to have agency and voice, and a way to construct their identities in their new context. Kwame saw entry into the colonizer's world. Through the processes of abrogation and appropriation, he was able to have a voice and to advocate for social change within the system. Similarly, the students have voices and motivations that are based on their personal situations and concepts of identity. As mentioned above, development often involves identity changes that can be difficult to initially embrace. This next step that we go through addresses this feature. It's a transculturation step that helps the students in a number of ways. The IMRAD model, explained previously, is a socialization step, which allows the students to understand and develop the kind of research that is expected in their thesis. The model is also the widely accepted thesis research format found throughout higher education, academic research, and the literature. It's something done outside of themselves, but something they seek to understand and to manage at a level that's acceptable to the wider community. However, a thesis project is a personal process of construction and authorship, a rite of passage into their academic and disciplinary worlds. How does the concept, process of transculturation help them bridge the gap between who they are and who they are aiming to be? Now that they have the beginnings of an understanding of the disciplinary norms in which they have to function in terms of research, they take that model and make it their thesis studies, their own, by writing it out in a simple narrative, which is their thesis story. And those were those things that we looked at the beginning of the presentation. Those were the first paragraphs of some of their stories. In the contact zone, they use their vernacular form of language to bring their voices and identities into a document that clearly belongs to the target community. This creates a kind of bridge that is a transcultural move into their fuller professional enculturation. It's a small move, but one we feel helps them make the thesis really their story. Throughout the initial stages, which occur within the first month of the fall term, we've been focusing on how the thesis is their story and how they are the central character in their stories. We also include the monomythical story structure, which is Joseph Campbell has done much research on this, how it's monomythical because almost every culture in the world has the hero's journey, where the hero goes through stages of departure, initiation, and transformed return, which I think really fits the story of thesis students. So armed as heroes of their thesis stories, they set about writing their story from the beginning to the end. The simple narrative story structure is common to all cultures and languages, and thus allows them to construct their projects in their own terms. We suggest they start their stories with once upon a time. This phrase takes us out of the present and situates us in a location in terms of research, the research setting, where we expect then to be introduced to characters, the researcher and the participants, that will have a role in the story, the research study. We then expect to find some event which leads us to the action of the story, the research problem or phenomena. The action then builds until a solution or resolution is found, research method and results. And then all the loose ends are tied up and the story ends in the conclusion. The narrative creates the central storyline of their thesis. They are placed in the central role as the central character. Thus, not only are they the creators, the directors of the action, they are the principal characters. And again, I have some comments, but I don't feel that this is very successful because it's difficult to see. But most of them talk about, for example, this one here, I was able to visualize whether I have a topic in a fun way. I enjoyed the activity and it helped me to guide my project. I found that my job it helped me know better. Well, she's talked about her job, it helped her know about narrative structure, and it was easy to work with. It was fun and useful and inspiring. I could feel my research is really mine since it was part of my life story. In addition, it helped me connect my past and my present. This one was a really useful one. I asked one of my classmates to read it before sending it to Blackboard we used, and found that this time she got what I was planning to do and what I was planning to do. It also helped me think and organize my research. So not only could they share it with people, but by writing this story, which ends up to be about a one-page story, they can see exactly what they're trying to do from the very beginning all the way to the end, and they can situate themselves as the author of this document, rather than it is a document that lives in some other discourse community that they've got to conform to. This little tiny step gives them the kind of ownership and lets them express their voice and their identity in it. Puebla's process of transculturation allowed him to communicate and function in the dominant discourse, to express himself and to maintain and strengthen his worldview, while at the same time integrate himself into the colonizing culture on his terms and to accomplish his rhetorical aims. Likewise, the same process can be used to ease students in transitional stages, particularly in thesis research writing, into the dominant culture which they choose to enter center while maintaining their worldviews and their sense of identity as they merge rather than are subsumed into their professional discourses. While this paper reports on local situations, the theoretical frameworks underlying the situations described inform the wider debate on writing and professional development. Issues of identity, voice, and transition, and how those are reacted to, struggled through, and negotiated are central experiences many people have. We feel that functioning in the context zone, as exemplified by Juan Foma's amazing letter, and the strategies we use with our students address these issues and help ease the processes. Thank you.
Bueno, yo estoy seguro que ustedes como yo siempre aprenden algo de Nancy Keranen, a mí me encanta escucharla, y estoy seguro que los tesistas que están presentes en este auditorio ahora entienden que son héroes de su propia historia, ¿no? Cosa que muchos maestros no entendemos. Bueno, tenemos 15 minutos para, antes del final de la sesión. Aquí hay una persona con tarjetas. Si ustedes desean hacer preguntas o intervenciones, bienvenidos. Esperamos sus comentarios. Bueno, no sé, ¿hay preguntas? Sí. La pregunta es, ¿hasta dónde el fenómeno de aculturación afecta la identidad de los alumnos?
Well, I think to answer this, you probably have to look at the theories associated with acculturation. And acculturation, again, is mainly used when referring to the processes that individuals go through, when, for example, they move from one language, maybe you could say national context, into another language national context. So if, when I moved here, I had some imperfect process of acculturation, but so I had to learn to live in a culture that has different customs and uses different language than what I use. Usually, and you can add to this, in terms of theories associated with moving into professional communities, the term enculturation is more associated with that. And that is, involves, I think it implies a more kind of voluntary desire to move in, to improve your life, or to have a voice, or to move into a professional community where language may or may not be different. And so I suppose that both terms affects the identity of the students, but it isn't, I don't see it as a negative thing, particularly in the case of enculturation, because the students have chosen to enter it and they want to participate in the community and they want to use the discourse that the community uses, because otherwise if they didn't, they would sound strange. I had an example of this. I went to a conference in spring, and when I sent the abstract for the paper, and this was a conference based on critical discourses and theories, and so when I saw the call for papers, there weren't any specific instructions about how to make the abstract. And so considering my topic, which had to do with critical issues, I decided to design the abstract in just the way I wanted to design it, which I never do really. So I went outside the boundaries of discourse and just created it. And so when it was accepted, but one of the organizers wrote back and they displayed the abstracts in the website and they wanted them all to look exactly the same. So obviously the one that I had designed based on my own preferences wasn't acceptable. And he said, well, if I hadn't fixed it, and if it didn't conform to all these other abstracts, it would have looked strange, it would have looked funny here. And so this idea of conforming to discourse communities is a negative issue. It's something that we all want to do. We all want to talk like everybody talks. But again, maintaining our own individual identities.
La pregunta es, ¿qué hay sobre el fenómeno que asocia la cosmovisión a la escritura? Yo imagino que se refiere a tu referencia a la cosmovisión andina, no sé si se refiere a eso, que trataba de expresar el escritor que tú mencionaste para explicarle al rey Felipe de España cuál era la cosmovisión andina. Imagino que tiene que ver con eso.
Okay. Well, the point is that Juan and Palma wanted to have a voice in the colonizing culture, and in order for the way he felt, the way to go about it was to create or to report the history of his culture, and to show that it was actually he made it very deliberately a parallel construction of the history of his world and the history of the colonizers' world, to say that, look, we're equal. The same things happen here that happen there. In fact, we were Christians, before you were. And so I think what he did, the reason he created this very detailed history of his culture was to orient his text and actually to inform the King of Spain that there is this world that exists that is apart from but equal to the world that you are trying to impose on us. And so I think that was his motivation for including his world vision and his way of looking at things, to say there is a different way of seeing it. It isn't just your viewpoint. And so once he's established that, established the history and the legitimacy of his own culture, he was creating space for him to say, now I have a voice and I can tell you what you probably should be doing in my world to make it function better.
So, for one is it possible types of language to better express, to better message of mixed languages? La pregunta es, ¿para una redacción es viable mezclar el tipo de lenguaje para poder expresar mejor a un lector en general?
I think it's always an advantage to be able to use several languages because, again, each language has its own emotional, each word in every language has a whole background behind it and has its own emotional weight. And so one of the things I like about English is that the vocabulary is very large because it borrows words from other countries, and it allows for a writer, English language because of the immigration of other words into the language, it allows very fine, nuanced meanings. So I think any time that other languages can be combined to create the rhetorical aims of the writing, it's an advantage. Where it would be a disadvantage is that if the reader didn't know the other language, so that could be a problem.
Muy bien, pues parece que ya no hay más preguntas y estamos en buen tiempo. Felicitemos otra vez a Nancy Keranen. Y como siempre hacemos entrega de su constancia como conferencista. Muchas gracias.